Hello and welcome to My Victorian Nightmare. I'm your host, Genevieve Mannion, and I'm here to talk about mysterious deaths, morbid fascinations, disturbing stories, and otherwise spooky events from the Victorian era. Because to me, there's just something especially intriguing, creepy, and oddly comforting about horror and mayhem from the 19th century. So, listener discretion is advised. Hello, friends, and welcome to this, my 9th episode. I am so glad to hear that many of you enjoyed the format of my last episode, where I read a few of the most disturbing and sexy articles I could find in the Illustrated Police News from 1871. I think I'll be doing that more often because it's so much fun to dig into those twisted little stories. And if there's anything else you particularly enjoy about this podcast, please let me know at myvictoriannightmare@gmail.com, or if you're listening on YouTube, feel free to leave a comment there. I read all of those and cherish them, even the ones that are yelling at me. I don't respond to them because they hurt my feelings, but I do appreciate the spirit. This includes corrections. Please feel free to give corrections if I'm mistaken about anything. Apparently in last week's episode, I incorrectly pronounced Peshtigo, Wisconsin. I think that's the right way to say it. I think I pronounced it Peshtigo. Please feel free to let me know if I misspeak. I will be very embarrassed. It will be very embarrassing for me, but I'm here to learn new things. I'm not an expert. I'm not a professional historian. I'm just someone who loves this stuff and wants to learn more. That's really what this is all about. So all corrections welcome. You can also follow and leave a comment on the Instagram, where I will be posting images from today's show. And nothing says, Genevieve, I love falling asleep to your podcast better than ratings on Spotify. Those ratings are keeping the podcast alive. I'm up to 70 and they're all 5 stars. I just can't with that. It really makes me want to cry. As long as folks keep letting me know they enjoy the podcast by rating it on Spotify and on Apple Podcasts, I will keep making episodes. So please continue to rate, review, subscribe, and share with all of your friends who also enjoy a life plagued with mood disorders. I personally name all of mine after hamsters that I had when I was a kid. It helps. Oh, I used to throw the most elaborate funerals for my hamsters when they died. My lord, the eulogies. What I wouldn't give to have one of my hamster eulogies read at my own funeral. If only I could remember. Where was I? Oh yes, some folks have indeed told me that they use the podcast to fall asleep, which I love that. I love that I'm literally haunting some of your dreams. Thank you for inviting me deep into your subconscious. I promise not to plant anything too disturbing there. Well, I might, though, because today we're talking about dangerous and deadly Victorian fashion. And although this episode on its face isn't terribly grisly, some of the descriptions for what happened to women who encountered arsenic in fabrics on a day-to-day basis, for example, is not for the faint of heart. We'll also be discussing how tuberculosis influenced fashion, hazardous beauty routines, deadly hat pins. We'll talk about just how dangerous corsets really were, and strange, kind of gross beauty trends, as well as some really weird and intriguing facts about Victorian fashion, men's and women's. I picked up a lot of neat details while sifting through all the radium and mercury. I'll also discuss a few horrifying situations where people became gravely ill and died because of the chemicals used in fabrics and accessories. My main references for today are a Smithsonian Magazine article by Emily Mullen, a collector article by Philippa Ogden, a VictorianHistorian.com article by Adam Shefts, and an Atlas Obscura article by Natasha Frost. These and all of my other references can be found in the show notes. So, let's begin. Something to keep in mind here while I talk about the unbelievably toxic and painful ways women would adhere to beauty standards in the Victorian era. Our current era is awash with botulism that is injected into the faces of girls as young as 18. Many beauty products currently include formaldehyde that causes cancer, parabens, those disrupt hormones and damage the reproductive system. We have aluminum in our deodorants. This is a neurotoxin. Coal tar dyes that are found in lipsticks and eyeshadows are carcinogens. I could go on and on. Women and men have been slathering themselves in toxic chemicals in the name of beauty for a millennia, and we show no signs of stopping. So when you hear some of the wild and dangerous ways women tried to maintain their beauty in the Victorian era, just remember women are currently getting black market butt injections that cause their hearts to stop. They're injecting all manner of chemicals into their lips. I personally use this little device nightly that electroshocks my face into producing more collagen. Allegedly. I'll take it. Let's start with, to me, was the most fascinating beauty trend of the early to mid 1800s. This is tuberculosis chic or consumptive chic. By the mid-1800s, tuberculosis was officially an epidemic in both Europe and the United States. This was a slow-killing disease that gradually, over the course of a few years, deteriorated the lungs as well as other organs. Victims of the disease would cough up blood, their skin would turn ivory pale, except for rosy cheeks likely caused by low-grade fever. Their eyes would become glassy and watery, they would become very thin due to very low appetite. Their veins would become visible through thinning skin, and their overall countenance would be weak and frail. This is exactly how I look naturally, by the way. I'm like a newborn baby fish. You can see right through to my heart. When I got married, my bridesmaids tried to make a hashtag for the day that was pale, frail, and under the veil. It didn't stick. Nobody used it, but I still wake up laughing about it. This deathly pallor was romanticized by Victorians and became entwined with perceptions of the ideal female. Weak, delicate, fragile, about to faint at any moment. It makes me think a little bit about heroin chic in the 90s. In the 1800s, tuberculosis was thought to be caused by either a hereditary susceptibility or by what they called, quote, bad air. In the mid-1800s, germ theory was just beginning to take hold, so they understood some illnesses can be carried through the air, they just didn't know exactly how yet. They thought germs, in general, could come into the home on the billowing skirts that women wore, and they weren't wrong about some of them. Tuberculosis is an airborne disease, similar to COVID, and on average in the 1800s, it would take about 5 years to kill you from infection to death. So it was, like I said, a very slow killer, making it an, quote, inoffensive death or good death, as it was referred to. Unlike other diseases of the day, like cholera or syphilis, which had simply horrid symptoms like vomiting, diarrhea, grotesque rashes, insanity, and brutal, painful deaths, tuberculosis was a very much preferable disease and considered dignified. You simply wasted away with plenty of time to plan your funeral, to settle affairs, and you generally remained lucid until the end. Even though today we have highly effective medical treatments, it's still the 10th leading cause of death worldwide. It's not getting any less dangerous over time. Even though it was preferable to other diseases of the day, it was still a very unpleasant way to die, but that didn't stop it from becoming fashionable. It imbued the notion of romantic feminine suffering, which could also be found in literature, operas like La Bohème and La Traviata, and many forms of fine art of the time. There's a beautiful painting by Edvard Munch of a grieving mother comforting her dying child. Munch actually survived tuberculosis as a child, something not many people did, but he created the painting to represent his guilt for surviving while his sister did not. Kill me. I'll put that painting on the Instagram. Flushed cheeks and fragile skeletal bodies became the picture of ideal feminine beauty. Corsets were meant to create a more thin, consumptive aesthetic, quote unquote. In the mid-1800s, large skirts further accentuated the pulled waists to make them appear even smaller. There appears to be some differing of opinion about exactly how much damage corsets did to the female body. It is true that tight lacing of corsets could and did shift organs around in the body, specifically the intestines, liver, and kidneys. But pregnancy does the same thing. Your organs shift all over the place. We're very elastic, Gumby creatures. Wearing tight corsets for long periods of time was definitely not a good idea, though. They caused poor digestion, constipation, irritated skin, and weakened back and chest muscles. They also bent the rib cage, and there's some fairly upsetting x-rays of women in corsets with their ribs kind of bunched up and illustrations of shifted organs. I'll put those on the Instagram. Although it is unclear just how much they contributed to reduced pelvis size, miscarriages, and uterine prolapse, which doctors at the time strongly insisted they did. Doctors also believed they caused postpartum infections and breast cancer, which was actually untrue. Doctors in general were very adamant about dangers of corsetry of the day. Historians have determined that women were probably not lacing their waists below 20 inches, though. By comparison, many U.S. sizes of extra, extra small are like 23.5 inches, so they could get very small, but most women likely weren't going that tight. The corset did, however, undeniably make women more faint and frail by compressing the lungs and diaphragm. Fainting, in general, was highly fashionable, as were the boxes of smelling salts, which were made of ammonium carbonate and perfume. Ammonium carbonate, by the way, is incredibly toxic. It can irritate your nose, throat, and lungs. It causes coughing, wheezing, and shortness of breath. Perfect for a lady suffering from a disease that affects the lungs. If she would feel faint, she would pull out a bottle, take a quick whiff, and zap herself back to her horrifying reality. And it wasn't just women with tuberculosis, or those who at least looked like they had it, who were romanticized. It was stereotyped that scholarly, artistic, poetic men became afflicted, and they transformed into something like martyrs. Men with the disease were associated with being gifted and creative, tortured artists wasting away, using their art to express their inner pain and sharing it with the world. Sounds a bit like the way Kurt Cobain is talked about and other male artists who've died of addictions. I couldn't find any information on how tuberculosis specifically influenced men's fashion, but I'm sure this brooding, thin, dark, pale and sickly Poe-like aesthetic was probably popular. That was all the guys I was into in high school anyway. Apart from people's rudimentary understanding of how the disease was transmitted, it was also believed among the upper classes that the more beautiful you were, the more predispositioned you were to catching the disease, because tuberculosis would enhance what was already established to be attractive about women: their frailty, thinness, and whiteness. Although it sounds racist, it probably was in some cases, certainly in the United States, but it was more classist, especially in places like England. A pale complexion was more associated with staying indoors, out of the sun, not working in the garden or working at all. Women of quality were thought to stay indoors, gossiping with other indoor ladies over tea sandwiches. Only peasants go outside to pick carrots, or whatever they said about poor people. Not every woman could be lucky enough to be infected with this deadly whitening disease, though, so they used different kinds of makeup and supplements which were full of poisons to make them look sickly. Makeup was perceived differently in the 1800s. It was something you applied in secret. There was an air of shame to it, in that makeup was believed to be for sex workers and actresses, and the no-makeup makeup look was what most women were trying to achieve. Not everything they used was toxic, though. It was common to use dandelion extract as something like a chemical peel. This chemical is still used in cosmetics today. Its chemical name is taraxacum? Taraxacum. It's anti-inflammatory, antibacterial, collagen-producing, and helps with sun damage. So not everything they used was battery acid. But then it was also common to cover your face with opium, which must have felt amazing, like before bed. They'd dab mercury around their eyes and eyebrows to help them grow longer, as they were told it would do. When they'd wake up, they'd scrub their face with ammonia. Then they'd squeeze a few drops of lemon in their eyes. Ugh. You could also spray them with perfume or add a few drops of belladonna. This was to make your eyes look more watery, part of the consumptive look, and dilate the pupils. Belladonna in your eyes eventually makes you go blind, by the way. To achieve a more ghastly pallor, women would take what were referred to as complexion wafers. These are little snacks full of arsenic. A popular brand was called Dr. Rose's or Dr. Campbell's arsenic complexion wafers. I'll put an advertisement for those on the Instagram. One of them reads, "She was certainly an exquisitely lovely creature. Nothing could have been added to enhance her beauty. She compelled admiration and was an object of worship. This is the universal result of the use of Dr. Campbell's safe arsenic complexion wafers. There were these little chalky wafers you'd chomp, like Neckos. Remember Neckos? I loved them and hated them when I was a kid. I think I ate them because I enjoyed the paradox of loving and hating something at the same time. Now we are all familiar with the effects of eating arsenic. Short-term exposure in very low doses will make you pale, translucent even. It will certainly suppress your appetite, but long-term exposure of even small doses will eventually lead to kidney damage, hair loss, vitiligo, precancerous lesions that are corn-like, yellowish, hyperkeratotic papules and plaques that appear on the palms and feet, but can also appear on other parts of the body that experience friction like the trunk and extremities. How dainty. Corn-like papules. Ugh. It's also important to note that women didn't not know that arsenic was a very toxic poison. Poisoning was a very common form of murder, specifically by women in the 1800s. Florence Maybrick poisoned her husband with arsenic in 1889. Lydia Sherman poisoned 3 husbands and several children in New York in the 1860s and 70s. I could go on, and I might in another episode. But just like we know the tox in Botox stands for toxin, we don't care. We assume there's been proper testing, and surely no one would sell us baby powder that causes uterine cancer. Johnson & Johnson, by the way, paid out $4.7 billion to 22 women because their talcum powder contained asbestos in 2018. Just like today, women assumed what they were using was safe, despite what may have appeared to be obvious and sometimes not so obvious dangers. Another fascinating trend to get that translucent look was to literally paint your entire body with enamels made of lead, which caused terrible rashes, which would then require more and more lead makeup to cover it up. In the 18th century, an English socialite, Maria Gunning, the Countess of Coventry, who was renowned for her beauty, died at just 27 after years of smearing her face with the most expensive face enamel you could buy. It was called Venetian Cherouse. It was essentially lead powder and vinegar. It was the same white pigment that Queen Elizabeth I used. Some believe it was lead poisoning from her makeup that killed her, but others believe she may have died of pneumonia, strep, or cancer. The most messed up theory about how she died is in regard to how her coronation ring had grown into her flesh. This was due to the fact that she never removed it for 45 years. I have a feeling something else was going on there to make that happen, but doctors insisted she have it removed. She did, and within a week, she died. Holy shit. Victorians' lead enamel makeup wasn't where you'd start. Older women, meaning not in their teens or 20s, would more likely use enameling because other cosmetics were no longer whitening or covering as well, or they now needed to cover up the damaged skin from what they had been using years prior with something more heavy-duty. After applying it and letting it dry, you had to keep your face virtually emotionless because it would crack. It was literally paint. The painting of Sargent's portrait, Madame X, was of a woman who used enamel. Her name was Virginie Gautreau. She also used indigo dyes to paint veins on her arms and neck. This was a popular trick to get that literally translucent skin effect. That was a very controversial piece of art, by the way. Her dress was originally painted without the beaded chain straps over her shoulders. And heavens, the work was derided as being the sluttiest painting ever made, so Sargent painted those straps to make it less slutty. Luckily, it's actually one of my very favorite paintings. A friend of mine was the official painting photographer for the Met in the early thousands, and he gave me the original negative of the first color photograph taken of the painting that the museum used. That was such a lovely gift. Not all fashion trends were based around blood-coughing diseases, though, and not all dresses were black. In 1775, a new pigment was developed called Scheele's green. It was unlike any green dye anyone had seen before, and in 1814, it was improved upon and became known as Paris green or emerald green. It was a dye made with the Victorians' favorite poison, arsenic, specifically an acidic copper arsenite. Before Queen Victoria's husband's death, she was known to wear gorgeous emerald green dresses made with this pigment. Of course, people knew arsenic was poisonous, but people didn't know that that was the main ingredient of the pigment until 1822, when the recipe was published. And when it was, manufacturers who used the dyes just lightened it a bit and even changed its name to make it appear as though it wasn't made with the same ingredients. Sneaky. This pigment was used in more than just clothing. It was used in carpets, paint, book bindings, wax candles, soaps, children's toys, wallpaper. It was even used in candy. I read an example of children dying from eating arsenic-dyed candy at a banquet held by the Irish Regiment in London in 1850. The tables were decorated with green sugar leaves that had been painted with Scheele's green powder that were taken home by attendees for their children, which resulted in several deaths. Children were most likely to die of arsenic poisoning at the time, apart from the elderly and those who were already sick. Articles began appearing in 1850 of suspected wallpaper poisonings, and in 1862 a child died in an East London home after licking green wallpaper that had been taken down. Queen Victoria had all of her green wallpaper taken down at Buckingham Palace after a visiting dignitary became sick in 1879. It's unclear how many people died directly because of daily interactions from the dye in their clothing and homes, and I imagine this was because long-term small-dose arsenic poisoning symptoms are so similar to many of the diseases of the time. Symptoms include abdominal pain, nausea and vomiting, diarrhea, cough, chest pain, shortness of breath, and sore throat, among others. These are similar to typhoid symptoms. It's likely many victims of arsenic dye poisoning were just thought to have something else. Kind of like today, how cancers caused by pesticides and other chemicals in our food aren't always attributed directly to those chemicals. Our death certificates just say cancer. Yikes. Okay. Here's a Victorian fashion fact that isn't deadly. It's just kind of gross. In 1905, the Gibson girl look became a trend. This was very high, bouffant hair. Gibson girls were illustrations by Charles Dana Gibson. All of his illustrations of women had these big, lovely hairstyles. So to get this look, women would save the hair that came out of their brushes, ball it up into what was literally called a hair rat, and brush their hair over it to get more lift. I love when people save cat fur from their brushes and needle point them into shoes and hats for their cats. Things like that make me so grateful for the internet. With these taller, ratted hairstyles came bigger and bigger hats. Hats made out of big fake flowers, feathers, ribbons, artificial fruit and lace. They were fabulous. And in the 1880s, hat pins were coming into style. These were pins that would attach these marvelous towering hats to their towering hair, and they made great weapons. In this period, women were more and more insistent upon walking in public alone. These were times where women's suffrage was heating up, and more women, despite the consequences, were insisting on casting off their escorts, which enraged men. Street harassment of unchaperoned ladies was happening more than ever before, and now women had a very fashionable deadly weapon to help them make it home safely. Women were using these hat pins for self-defense so successfully that laws were proposed to limit the size of hat pins. In 1910, a woman wrote a letter in a newspaper about these laws that read, quote, "I always feel safe going home late at night with a hat pin available for protection. Before leaving a streetcar, I always carry a hat pin ready in my hand until I'm safe within the door of my house." Thousands of other women undoubtedly can speak from their experience of how a stout hat pin has been an effective defense in times of danger. There was a man actually murdered with a hat pin in 1898 in a Chicago saloon. A Parisian tourist named Bartholomew Brant Brander was stabbed through the corner of the eye into his brain. But I didn't find any more examples of hat pin murders in the 1800s, just guys who got stabbed while trying to rob or harass women who lived to tell the tale. Okay, A little history of the beard in the 1800s. They went in and out of style. In the very beginning of the 1800s, they were totally out of style. By the 1850s, they were back in style. But between 1850 and 1880, with germ theory catching on, it was believed that beards could carry and spread disease, so they went out of style, but they quickly came back into fashion in the 1890s when that idea diminished. Then they went back out of style at the turn of the century, where the infamous handlebar mustache took center stage. Now again, in the very beginning of the 1800s, beards were terribly out of fashion, but one man by the name of Joseph Palmer, a farmer in Fitchburg, Massachusetts, he was a veteran of the War of 1812, decided to let his beard grow long. He was ridiculed and mocked for it, and one day in 1830, 4 men attacked him with razors and scissors, trying to forcibly cut it off. Palmer had a knife on him and sliced one of his attackers. He didn't kill him, though, but he was arrested for assault. Not the other guys, he was. He was charged a $10 fine, $40 in court fees, and $700 in bail. That was about $23,000. He refused to pay any of it, so they put him in jail. His sentence was 15 months, where he was repeatedly attacked for having the beard. After a year, he was told he could be released if he just paid the fine of $10, but he still refused. He said paying anything would be admitting that he did something wrong, which he didn't do. He was only defending himself after all. In court, he said, quote, "If I ain't a safe person to have my liberty, I ought not to go out, and I am willing to stay in confinement till I am." End quote. Eventually, the judge who put him in jail was sent a letter from his mother pleading with him to release him. He brought the letter to the jail, and the letter convinced Joseph to just pay the $10. He spent about a year in jail. He never shaved that beard, though, and when he died in 1873 at the age of 82, he had a big image of his face with his big beard placed on his headstone with the engraving, quote, "Persecuted for wearing the beard." End quote. I'll put that picture of the stone on the Instagram. It is fantastic. Okay, here are a few examples of people who didn't just get sick from the chemicals used in fabrics, makeup, and accessories, but died tragically. There was one particular death in 1861 attributed directly to Scheele's green arsenic powder dye that was so disturbing that the dye went almost completely out of style afterward. A 19-year-old woman named Matilda Schurer worked in a warehouse where she dusted this green powder onto faux leaves for flower crowns. An article about her death was very detailed. It stated that, quote, "She one day complained of a pain in the side and an intense thirst. She was seized with vomiting, and the refuse of the stomach was of a greenish color. Witnesses took her to the doctor on the following morning, who told her she was again suffering from the effects of poison. She had been ill several times before and complained of pains in the stomach and sickness for the last year and a half. She was engaged as an artificial florist in the warehouse of M. Bergerond, and up to the time of her death, she had been employed in leaf making. The leaves were made of wax, and while wet, emerald green powder was sprinkled upon them. She was in the greatest pain until she became insensible, when death put an end to her sufferings. Mr. James Thomas Paul, surgeon, had made a post-mortem examination and found the body of a greenish-yellow color. The eyes were also of that color. The nails were very green, and the countenance was of a particularly anxious character. The lungs gave presence of arsenite of copper, the liver being highly impregnated, as also the mesenteric glands. The stomach was much inflamed with bunches of gangrenous ulcerations. The kidneys were healthy. There was also inflammation of the mucous membrane of the bronchial tubes, no doubt caused by the contact with the arsenite of copper." End quote. The article goes on to say that her sister, who had also worked in that factory, died under similar circumstances and was sent to the hospital where she was treated for fever, quote unquote, but now they know what really killed her. The article also states that the owner of the factory where these arsenic leaves were created employed 98 girls. He said he offered to give them masks, but they all objected because it was too hot in the factory. It's unclear how many of these other women no doubt died or were made deathly ill in this factory, but considering how this girl's own sister died of, quote, fever, makes me think this may have been similar to the situation of the radium girls. These were girls in the early 1900s who used radium to paint glow-in-the-dark watch faces. They used to lick the brushes to get a finer point when they painted. When the girls started dying of radium poisoning, the business owners had their death certificates falsely written as being caused by syphilis in an attempt to smear them, which is one of the most diabolical things I'd ever read. Many of the girls developed anemia, bone fractures, and necrosis of the jaw. One poor woman's jaw fell away entirely from her skull before she died. Sweetheart. Some of the very sick women sued their employers and settled out of court in 1928. Marie Curie, who discovered the existence of radium, and her husband were both buried in lead-lined tombs because their corpses were dangerously radioactive when they died. All of her laboratory equipment, all of the papers, even her cookbooks still remain too radioactive to be safely handled without special equipment. Matilda's case led to arsenic green dye going out of style, but I don't know if it led to any criminal accusations against the owner. It doesn't appear that it did. His "I told those ladies to wear masks but they didn't want to" argument appears to have been all there was to that. But the Radium Girls case led to the establishment of occupational disease labor law, which is the right to sue for damages from corporations due to labor abuse. Many of the women who worked in that factory died of radium poisoning, but not all of them. A woman named May Keene lived to be 107 years old. She died in 2014, so she was made of Teflon, apparently. Well, that was some very difficult information to hear. I really hope you're okay after all this. This was a doozy. Congratulate yourself on making it all the way to the end. But here's something to make you feel a little better. Remember those hat pin laws that cities tried to pass to prevent women from defending themselves? Well, women didn't really pay much mind to these laws. In November 1912, women in Sydney, Australia were arrested and sent to jail for not abiding by the short hat pin laws. The Times wrote, and you're going to love this, this is a quote, "They declare that the law prohibiting protruding hat pins is iniquitous and unnecessary legislation, and they will not submit to it. What is more, if they are kept in a jail long, they will starve themselves to death. So there now!" Exclamation point. End quote. I think we need to bring the hat pin back, ladies. What do you think? Thank you so much again for listening, and if you enjoy this podcast and would like to hear more, rate, review, and subscribe. Be kind to yourselves, and I will see you in your nightmares.